Hello and welcome back to another video for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies. We're continuing Judaism Theme 4 by looking at Hasidic Judaism. So first of all, who was the Baal Shem Tov, who you can see on the right? Now, Hasidic Judaism has its roots in a religious movement that began in Poland in the 18th century. And the founder was Israel ben Eliezer, who lived from 1698 to 1760. And he was an itinerant preacher and healer, also known as the Baal Shem Tov, or Besht, meaning master of the good name, or the name of God. Sadlo notes that despite the existence of a vast amount of hagiographical literature that arose after his death, so hagiographical literature is sort of praiseworthy writings that are made about an important figure after they've died, okay, that often aren't true, but they're anachronistic and sort of saying, oh, this person that we revere was so wonderful for these reasons, okay? So there's a lot of that concerning the Baal Shem Tov, but we don't actually have a lot of historical knowledge about his life, except that he had an unusual childhood before becoming a great scholar and a mystic. Sattler also claims that Ben Eliezer was by far the most famous individual to emerge from a tradition of Jewish shamanism, which was practiced in Poland at that time. So, as shamans believed that they could effectively acquire direct contact with the Almighty. Okay, and it's sort of this spiritual mystic tradition, and he was the most famous to come from it. But at the same time, Besht belonged to a group of ascetic Jews known as the Hasidim, which translates as the pious ones, and they sought direct spiritual contact with God. And the fact that they were ascetic Jews means that they relinquished all sort of worldly pleasures and focused on spiritual discipline and exercises. So he was, on the one hand, a mystic, someone who's associated with sort of communicating perhaps with the dead or having this spiritual sort of secret line with God, but at the same time being an ascetic sort of pious Jew. He was both of those. But he did not conform to the usual pattern of Hasidic behavior, right? He didn't because the Hasidim, the pious ones, they would often pray. They were very pious, very sort of reserved, and they would only pray for their own benefit and for their clients, perhaps. But Besht prayed not only for his benefit and for his clients, but also for the whole of the Jewish community, and so he was revolutionary in that sense. And the legends about him depict a charismatic man who attracted huge crowds with his message that the presence of God can be found in all creation, right? So there's the emphasis that he has on encountering, if you like, God's presence in the world. But he wanted to make this sort of accessible to the ordinary Jew. Okay, so he wasn't like a Hasidim sort of in a spiritual ivory tower, if you like, right? Set apart from everyone else who just spends all day praying locked up in a room or a cell. Rather, he went out to the people, sort of like a Christ-like figure, some have argued, and he brings this message as a charismatic preacher. It's also reported that he was able to use the divine name, right, Yahweh, to perform miraculous acts of healing. So he was also a miracle worker and a healer. He taught that one did not have to be a Hebrew scholar to live in the presence of God, but that participation in the world and spiritual exercises surpassed Torah study. So at the time, a lot of these sort of traditional aspects of Judaism were becoming quite stale and dry for many Jews, right? There was an emphasis on scholarship, study, especially of the Torah, right? But he says that no, to experience God and to know God, you don't have to be this very intellectual scholar who studied all of the Torah. Rather, you can actually be a normal person, right? You can be a normal Jew and pray and participate in the world just as in a regular sort of fashion, okay? And that is a possible way to encounter God in daily life. He also placed a new emphasis on the concepts of sincerity and love, famously stating God loves all Jews without distinction. Okay, he doesn't just love the ones that say the Torah and that keep the most mitzvot, he loves them all the same. Hence, he stressed the importance of a concept known as devekut, which means clinging on to God, to the extent that one's devotion to him is so intense that one's heart is on fire with love of God. So he's preaching this fiery, passionate message of devekut, right, of clinging on to God, that the ordinary Jew can also adopt. Close gives an analogy of of this concept of Devakut in the small child who fully loves his father, right? But they cannot express their feelings in words. And this is the idea that Besht is arguing that the ordinary Jew should have towards God, right? That we should have this unconditional childlike love towards God, even if that can't be put onto words. But we need to cling on to him and remain close to him. As a result, a Jewish revival took place under the Baal Shem Tov's leadership, characterized by extreme intensity of belief and enthusiasm in worship. So you might be getting the impression that the Baal Shem Tov was quite an enthusiastic, charismatic, joyous man who was sort of down with the people, if you like, right? And he was encouraging them to search God, to love him, to cling on to him, and to pray with intensity and enthusiasm. His followers were also inspired to worship God and to keep the commandments in a simple but joyous way through things like laughing, dancing, and singing their praises to God. And you can imagine that these new practices are going to be quite shocking and perhaps dangerous for traditional Jews who focus more on sort of going to the synagogue and set prayers and studying sacred scriptures rather than this sort of dancing and joyous, almost sort of unholy, some would say, show of one's piety. Okay, this is something that the Baal Shem Tov introduced, that perhaps was quite revolutionary, but also quite appealing for a lot of Jews. You can see that this is sort of allowing, if you like, the ordinary Jew to express their love for God in a way that they hadn't done before. But Sattler does believe, right, he's an important scholar for this topic, Sattler believes that it's anachronistic to see Ben Eliezer, or Besht, or the Baal Shem Tov, whatever you want to call him, as the founder of what would be transformed into modern-day Hasidism. Okay, so it's not accurate that the Hasidic Judaism that we have today is the one, perhaps, that the Baal Shem Tov, invented, if you like. There's continuity and there's similarities, but there has been a natural evolution of it as well. Instead, Sattler proposes that it was the Baal Shem Tov's disciples who created a lot of the distinctive ideas and practices of the Hasidic movement, but that this was nonetheless based upon the Baal Shem Tov's teachings and practices. So Hasidic Judaism comes from this charismatic preacher, healer, and scholar and mystic as well, called the Baal Shem Tov. But why did the Mitnagdim oppose Hasidism? So you can sort of begin to wonder why this would be quite a controversial movement, right? And there was a group called the Mitnagdim which opposed this new movement. So as the Hasidic movement spread throughout Eastern Europe, some Orthodox rabbis, right, the traditional ones, feared that it was a revolutionary and religiously liberal movement that would actually threaten their tradition. So in 1760, the Baal Shem Tov had incurred the wrath of the Vilna Gaon, okay, who you can see on the right. And he was a renowned rabbinic scholar and spiritual leader of Vilna, which is, but I believe it's in Lithuania. And also, not just of the Vilna Gaon, but also of a lot of the other important scholars in traditional Judaism. So he got on their bad side. And these opponents of the new movement of Hasidism were known as the Mitnagdim, and they denounced it as a heretical movement. Robinson also explains that the Mitnagdim saw the anti-intellectualism as a direct threat, as well as their new enthusiastic modes of worship. So the two main dangers that the Mitnagdim foresaw in Hasidism were its anti-intellectualism, so its emphasis of focus more on love and sincerity rather than study, right? And the second one was this idea of laughing, dancing, singing, enthusiastically worshipping, okay? And they feared these two innovations, rather. As a result, the Vilna Gaon excommunicated, right, he banished the Hasidim in 1772, leading to growing tensions between the Orthodox and Hasidic communities. Rabbi Dov Bayer instructed his followers not to respond to the Orthodox hostility, though, and even though they had been denounced to the Russian government by the Orthodox movement, the Hasidic movement rather, survived, and it strengthened going on into the 19th century, and even nowadays it's a thriving community among Jews. So how is prayer important for Hasidic Jews? We've already mentioned their distinctive form of worship, but why is prayer important? Now, the emphasis which the Baal Shem Tov placed upon devakut and attachment to God encouraged worship to become more spiritually enriching and intense. Besh therefore argued that prayer is the centre of the day and should continue beyond just the daily hour. It needs to be done without ceasing. However, an essential element of prayer, which we've looked at on the video on Tefillah, is known as kavanah. Kavanah is intention. And Ben Eliezer said that one should be so concentrated in prayer that you will be willing to die during it. So we need to have that intention and that concentration to the point where you would be willing to die. As a result, the early Hasidim did away with set prayer times, right, rigid sort of this hour and this hour you have to pray. They did away with that, and instead they encouraged their followers to pray honestly, right, and genuinely when they wanted to throughout the entire day with the intention, with kavanah. Hence, the Shulchan Aruch states, in accordance with this belief, that better a little supplication with kavanah than much without it. Okay, so you need to be constantly praying, but it needs to have intention. And that's why Maimonides actually said that if you pray without kavanah, without intention, then it needs to be redone. It's useless. Hasidic prayer is also characterized by great joy and can be accompanied, as we've seen, by dancing, violent movements of the body, and even cartwheels. The Baal Shem Tov was also said to tremble so greatly in his prayer, the bits of grain in a nearby barrel would shake too. Okay, so that's just an example of his devotion and his concentration in prayer. Other tales about him state that when a disciple touched his clothing, he was so seized with tremors that he had to pray for relief. Hasidic prayer is also accompanied by wordless melodies called nigunim, which represent the overall mood of the prayer, such as things like lai lai lai. So they'll sort of repeat these, words, if you like. Well, they're not really words, they're just melodies that don't supposedly mean anything, but they represent the overall sense of the prayer. Okay, so they just repeat la 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 la, like endlessly. Okay, and often do movements, cartwheels, whatever. Okay, which for an outsider might seem a bit bizarre, right? Why are you doing that? How's that prayer? But this is an essential sort of, albeit strange, characteristic of Hasidic prayer. Best also taught that the nigunim provide a musical connection to God that transcends ordinary language. So you might think it's a bit weird that they're just repeating la 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 and doing these wordless melodies, but actually they go beyond just ordinary human language and provide like a musical sort of link to God. Hence, the Hasidic emphasis on devakut and joyous prayer show that every act in our daily life can become holy and also can be viewed as a way to worship God, who manifests himself in creation. Again, there's an emphasis that God can be found in his creation and that Jews can approach him in prayer and in joyous worship. Now, how is the Hasidic liturgy different? So we looked at prayer, but the liturgy is the sort of the structure of their services, right? The synagogue. So the Baal Shem Tov modified the liturgy by introducing two innovations to the Friday services at the synagogue. Number one, the recitation of Psalm 107 before the Friday afternoon service as a prelude to the Shabbat or the Sabbath. And also number two, reciting Psalm 23 just before the end of the evening service. So Psalm 23 is that famous psalm which begins with "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Right, quite a famous one. So they say that at the end of the evening service. So he introduced these two psalms to be said at the beginning and end of this service. The Hasidim also adopted a new prayer rite and prayed according to one of the variations of the Siddur, the set prayer book, known as Nusach Sefard, since the practical application of Kabbalistic concepts and ideas have been incorporated into the daily ritual of Hasidic Jews. So Hasidic Judaism does take a lot of influence actually from Kabbalah, right, from the mystical, esoteric tradition of Judaism as well. For example, the Nusach Sefard. A further modification was the introduction of the practice of reciting the Psalms and prayers in Ashkenazi Hebrew, which was the language of the first Hasidim. So it's a different dialect of Hebrew, tracing back to their roots. Now, what is the role of the Rebbe? Okay, so you can see on the right, we have an image there of the Rebbe. He is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who is a very, very influential and renowned figure within Hasidic Judaism within the past century, actually. Now, towards the middle of the 18th century, a new feature of the Hasidic movement became established in the form of a new kind of leader. So this was again after Baal Shem Tov, after he had passed away. It's an evolution. Okay, so remember the Hasidic movement hasn't always remained the same. There have been developments, and this is one example. So this new kind of leader was known as the Rebbe, or the Tzaddik, meaning righteous one. The Rebbe was and is considered to have attained the highest level of devakut, right, devotion, and as such, he is seen as spiritually superior to ordinary people. Con Sherbuck therefore states that devakut to God, right, clinging on or devotion to God, involved cleaving to the tzaddik, to the Rebbe, right, who acted as a kind of intermediary between God and man. So if you want to get to God, you have to go through the Rebbe, or if you are devoted to the Rebbe, you will be devoted to God. The role of the Rebbe also became a hereditary one, right, meaning that fathers passed on their position to their sons or sons-in-law, thus resulting in the creation of dynasties with different Rebbes. So in different areas of the world, there are different dynasties with different Rebbes. So there's not just one Rebbe. However, the Baal Shem Tov himself did not pass his status to his son, but to Dov Ba'er, due to the latter's greater piety. Okay, so this is an exception to the rule. Now, according to Blumenthal, the Rebbe had to set an example of piety, as well as teach, preach, and train disciples. So those are some of the things he has to do. The Rebbe served as a figure of absolute authority as well on spiritual and religious matters, with his decisions being final. So in a way, you could roughly, but not exactly, compare him to perhaps the Pope within Catholicism, right? He obviously doesn't have as much of an influence, and he's not. There are obviously some differences, but he is a figure of great authority in spiritual and religious matters. Hasidic Jews will also bring the Rebbe a kavittel, which is a piece of paper with a prayer request on it for the tzaddik to pray. So it's sort of like bringing their prayers to the Rebbe to pray for them. There's also the occasion of Tish, which you can see depicted on the right, and this often takes place on festivals like Shabbat, where the Hasidic community gathers around the Rebbe for a ceremonial meal. The Rebbe will eat a small amount of a large plate of food, which is then passed around to the devotees gathered around him, and they consider the food that he has just eaten a little bit of, they consider it blessed and spiritually healing. Furthermore, the Tish is a joyous occasion of singing and dancing, and the Rebbe will give a speech and blessing to the devotees. Again, there's an emphasis on joy, right? And singing and dancing as ways of actually worshipping God. The Rebbe is indeed held in such a high regard within Hasidism that many of his disciples take special care to observe the way in which he acts, also the way in which he eats, drinks, or, as a famous tale states, how he ties his shoes. There's a famous tale that talks about a pious Hasidic Jew who travels miles and miles and miles just to see the Rebbe, and then someone asks him, why have you come so far to see him? And he answers, I wanted to see how he ties his shoes. Okay, and so it just shows how much of a sort of spiritual and religious role and authority that he has and that he plays in the lives of Hasidic Jews. Okay, now what are the essential Hasidic beliefs? So we've looked at the importance of different practices like prayer and the liturgy and the role of the Rebbe, but what do they actually believe as well, perhaps that are distinctive from other forms of Judaism? Well, like other Orthodox Jews, though, Hasidic Jews do accept that God revealed the written and oral Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, so they could be considered a form of orthodoxy, in which they still believe the traditional beliefs about the Torah, for example. They thus view rigid obedience to all the mitzvot a duty and a form of devotion to God. By living a pious life in accordance with the mitzvot, Hasidic Jews strengthen their identity and have a sense of fulfillment and spiritual direction, which is a cause for great joy. Again, there's the emphasis on joy, but that is achieved by following the mitzvot. This is why the Kotzker Rebbe said joyfulness is the outcome of holiness. Okay, that's a really lovely quotation to use in an essay. Joyfulness is the outcome of holiness. So if you are being holy by following the mitzvot, right, then you will naturally be joy. Because living with joy helps the Hasid to acknowledge God's goodness and glory, right? If you're being joyful, you are closer to God. Furthermore, Hasidic Jews continually practice devakut by keeping God constantly in the mind, so that every thought and action reflects this view. They also place great emphasis upon God's omnipresence and how he can be encountered in the small things of daily life, right? Remember how Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, was preaching that God's presence can be found in creation by all, not just Hebrew scholars. As a result of this joyful observance of mitzvot, Hasidic Jews not only grow closer to God, but also set an ethical example to others, which they are obliged to do as part of the Mosaic covenant, right? So they're not just developing their own spiritual relationship and getting joy out of it, but they are actually fulfilling their part of the Mosaic covenant, which we looked at earlier on in the course, and they're also spreading God's word, if you like. In addition, Hasidism stresses the importance of spiritual purity meaning that men often use a mikveh, right, the ritual cleansing bath, and many will immerse themselves daily in it before attending morning prayer. So there is also the emphasis not just on the observance of the mitzvah, but also on spiritual purity through the mikveh. There's also a greater emphasis on religious experience through worship in Hasidism, rather than traditional study. And this is actually considered to hold equal importance with observation of the mitzvot. Okay, so there's not just sort of doing command in like a dry fashion when you're just repeating or doing these things for the sake of doing them, and not just studying as well, which, although the Hasidism places less of an emphasis on study, there is still an emphasis on it. There's also a bigger emphasis perhaps on religious experience in joyous worship. And this has equally led to the development of a mystical tradition known as Kabbalah, whose main text, the Zohar, teaches that the mitzvot reveal hidden truths about the upper world. And so there's a relationship between Hasidism and Kabbalah as well, because remember that we said that the Besh was actually a mystic, not just a scholar, but a mystic as well, who believed in this way of religious experience that transcends ordinary experience as well. Now, how has Hasidism survived? Because it's obviously was quite a revolutionary movement. It was quite controversial. We've seen in the opposition of the Mitnagdim, and it has a lot of things that perhaps many Orthodox Jews would consider heretical or wrong, right? But it has managed to survive. So Hasidic Jews tend to live in closed, tight-knit communities, as it would be difficult to live according to the requirements of their faith in mainstream society, right? So they live together. As such, membership to the group is by birth, and matrilineal descent is the means by which a child is recognised as being Jewish, right? So through the mother. Hasidic Jews also value the family very highly, often marrying as soon as they are legally able to do so. With such a high birth rate as well, and a dislike of contraception, the Hasidic community is flourishing and is actually growing more than other Jewish sects. Okay, and you can see on this image here there are quite a lot of children, and Hasidic Jews are known for having many, many children and big families. And even when facing persecution by Russian authorities, the Orthodox community, as well, and pressure to modernize in the Haskalah, which was the Jewish Enlightenment, the Hasidic movement carried on despite all these persecutions and challenges and retained its distinctive identity and practice. In fact, some have argued that it was the Hasidic movement, right, ironically, which actually preserved Talmudic study and the belief in traditional Jewish values despite the challenges of the Haskalah. So the Haskalah was the Jewish Enlightenment, where a lot of sort of liberal ideas were infiltrating, if you like, traditional Judaism. And so they were questioning the importance of Torah and Talmudic study and traditional beliefs such as the divine origin of the Torah and the Talmud. Whereas Hasidism actually stressed, no, the Torah comes from God and we still need to study it, right? Even though that's not the most important thing. So ironically, although some critique it for sort of placing less of an emphasis on study, others have argued that actually it's been influential in preserving Jewish texts and traditional beliefs and encouraging the study of these texts. Moreover, the initial hostility that Orthodox Jews had towards the Hasidim has now dissolved, and Kon Sherbok says that both groups are united in their abhorrence of liberal Judaism. So even though they might have difference in practice and certain beliefs, they are pretty much united in their traditional conservative and Orthodox doctrines, and for that reason they are united, right, in their abhorrence to progressive, like Reform Judaism. And this is further supported by the fact that Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the UK, praised the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who we saw a couple of slides ago, right, the guy with the black hat. He praised him as a source of leadership in others. And so there are very cordial relationships between Orthodox and Hasidic Jews to this day. And it's clear why they've been able to survive, because of this sort of emphasis of joy in worship, and how they sort of stick together in close, tight-knit communities to preserve their distinctive identity. Okay, so that's everything for Hasidic Judaism. Thank you very much.